Hello and welcome to this video on comparative advantage. The theory of comparative advantage is one of the most important in modern macroeconomics and underpins many economists' recommendations for specialization and trade. This economist here, Paul Krugman, is quoted as saying, "If there was an economist's creed, it would surely contain the affirmations, I believe in the principle of comparative advantage and I believe in free trade." So in this video, we're going to look at the concept of comparative advantage, be able to apply it to an example, and then evaluate this theory. So previously we looked at the theory of absolute advantage, and that occurs when one country produces a good or service more cheaply than another. And we found that when that occurs and countries specialize in trade, they can both be better off, they can both achieve outside their PPFs. Now this might not be too surprising to you. This might be a little bit like duh, because the UK was better at cars and China was better at bread, so therefore it kind of feels like it makes sense that countries should specialize in this situation, in what they're good at, and then trade. But in this video we're going to take it a little bit further. And we're going to pose the question, what if one country is better at producing both goods and services than another? Can it still make sense for them to specialize in trade? So we're going to have a look at this example in this video. Again, we're going to look at a very simple world economy here. We just have two countries and we have two products. And this shows us the production possibilities in one day. In the UK, they could produce 12 cars or 3 loaves of bread. And in China, they could produce 16 cars or 8 loaves of bread. So this gives us the production possibility frontier. For the UK, it could do 12 or 3. Or for China, it could do 14 or 8. Now, what we see very clearly straight away is that the China has the absolute advantage in both the production of cars and bread. So China has the absolute advantage in production of both cars and bread. And this is the key question that we're posing here as economists. Does it still make economic sense for the UK and China to specialize in one product, either cars or bread, and then trade? Can they both achieve consumption outside of their production possibility frontiers? Or is it going to be impossible for China to do that? And this question was posed by a 19th century economist called David Ricardo, and he came up with the concept of the theory of comparative advantage that shows why countries may still specialize and benefit from trade. He addressed this question and concluded both countries could still benefit from trade and specialization if the relative costs of production differed, i.e. it wasn't important if one country was better at both. It was important if one country was better at producing one item relative to the other items it could produce. So he defined comparative advantage as existing when a country is able to produce a good more cheaply relative to the other goods it produces than another country. The theory of comparative advantage suggests that countries will still find it mutually advantageous to trade if the opportunity cost of production of goods differs. So we need to know the opportunity costs here. By focusing on one good, how much do I sacrifice of another good? So let's go back to our example here of the UK and China, where China has the absolute advantage in both. And so we can compare our final scenario. We're going to have a look at a scenario here where there's no specialization and no trade. If the UK was to spend half a day producing cars and half a day producing bread, it could produce 6 cars and 1.5 loaves of bread. China, in one day, spending half their time on each, would produce 8 cars or 4 loaves of bread. So this is what these countries could have. They'd be halfway along their PPFs if they didn't specialize, if they were just self-sufficient, produce both goods. Now we're going to find out which country and see if countries here possess a comparative advantage in the production of a good or service. So a reminder, the comparative advantage exists when a country is able to produce a good more cheaply relative to other goods produced domestically in comparison to another country. Countries will still then find it mutually advantageous to trade if the opportunity cost of production of goods differs. So a reminder, here are our production possibilities, 12 or 3, and in China 16 or 8. And in order to work out what something costs to produce relative to other goods that are being produced, effectively we're asking to find out what the opportunity cost is. When I produce a car, what is the cost to me in terms of bread? When I produce bread, what is the cost to the economy in terms of cars foregone? So if we have a look at the opportunity cost of a car, first of all, when the UK produces a car, it sacrifices a quarter of a loaf of bread because it could have done that in that time. When China produces a car, it sacrifices half a loaf of bread. If we flip it around and look at it from the perspective of loaves of bread, when the UK in one day could produce 3 loaves of bread, in one day it could also have produced 12 cars. So for each loaf of bread, it's sacrificing 4 cars. So the opportunity cost of 1 loaf of bread in the UK is 4 cars, and the opportunity cost in China of 1 loaf of bread is 2 cars. So we can see the opportunity costs are different here. So we know that comparative advantage must exist. The relative costs are different. So let's consider first of all the comparative advantage in the production of cars. Who has the comparative advantage in the production of cars? Who sacrifices less when they produce cars? And if we have a look at our table, we can see that the UK sacrifices only a quarter of a loaf of bread, whereas China sacrifices half a loaf of bread. So we would say that the comparative advantage in car production belongs to the UK. If we look at producing bread, when the UK produces bread, it sacrifices a lot of cars. So it's quite a big cost to producing bread. When China produces bread, it only sacrifices 2 cars. So it's got the lower opportunity cost. So China has the comparative advantage in bread production. So this is how we work out who has the comparative advantage. We look at the opportunity cost. If you have the lowest opportunity cost for that good or service, you have the comparative advantage. So UK has the comparative advantage in car production, China has the comparative advantage in bread production, and the theory of comparative advantage states that countries should specialize in those goods, and then through trading they can be better off. So the UK is going to specialize in car production, and so just produce 12 cars. China is going to specialize in bread production, just produce 8 loaves of bread. And then we're going to split them. We're going to trade, and we're going to trade it like this. The 8 loaves of bread are going to be spread out, 3 to the UK and 5 to China. And the 12 cars the UK has produced, 7 are going to go to China and 5 are going to stay in the UK. So has this worked? By specializing in trading, have we actually managed to achieve better than these countries could do individually? Well, a reminder of our production possibility frontier that demonstrates, underpins all this. And here are our PPFs. In the first situation, in our self-sufficient scenario, we said that the UK could be at this point on its PPF, 6 cars and 1.5 loaf of bread, and China would be at this point on its PPF, 8 cars and 4 loaves of bread. And the question is, when we specialized in trade and we came up with this solution, are these positions on the PPFs, or have both countries managed to achieve positions outside? So first of all, let's have a look at the UK. The UK has 5 cars and 3 loaves of bread. So that would put the UK here. So we can see outside its PPF. So by specializing in trading, the UK is doing better. The real big question, though, is will this be the same for China? We gave China 7 cars of the 12 being produced and 5 loaves of bread, which would place China here. And again, we can see, yes, China would be consuming quantities outside of its PPF. So even though China is better at producing both cars and bread, it can still do better than that through specializing in the production of the good in which it has the comparative advantage, and then trading with other countries, for example here with the UK. So this is kind of magical. We learned originally that you can't achieve quantities outside your PPF. But this theory, this mathematical and economic concept, shows us that through establishing which country has comparative advantage of production and then trading, both countries can benefit. So, some morals. China had the absolute advantage in the production of both cars and bread. However, it was still beneficial to specialise in trade with the UK because comparative advantage existed. Both countries managed to consume quantities of goods that they could not make themselves given the available resources. The UK was relatively better at making cars than bread, and China was relatively better at making bread than cars. Both of them possessed a lower opportunity cost. So this underpins much of the rationale why economists promote free trade. Specialization between developed and developing economies, between Germany and Chad, between the UK and China. All these countries can benefit from specialization and trade if they follow the way in which the law of comparative advantage suggests economies should operate. So why does this happen? What is going on here? Well, David Ricardo believed that all costs of production could be reduced to labor costs, and this belief is known as the labor theory of value. He argues that differences in comparative costs were down to differences in the productivity of labor, and suggested that high labor productivity countries would have a comparative advantage in the production of sophisticated high technology goods, whilst low productivity countries would have a comparative advantage in the production of low technology goods. Now, what are the assumptions that we've made here in this theory? Well, we have assumed that there are no transport costs between the UK and China, which may undo some of the benefits of this trade. We've assumed that there are costs are constant and there are no economies of scale. It's a very simple example. There are only two economies producing goods. Once we escalate it to 3 economies, 4 economies, 5 economies, the maths gets a lot more complicated. We've assumed that bread and cars produced in the UK and China are homogeneous, are identical in quality. And we've assumed here that factors of production are mobile. We can shift car production to the UK and bread production to China. We've assumed no barriers to trade. And we've assumed perfect knowledge. Some additional notes. When we draw the two countries' PPFs, we can tell straight away whether comparative advantage is going to exist or not, because if they have the same gradient, then the opportunity costs are the same and no country will have a comparative advantage. Remember, if the opportunity costs are the same, there is no comparative advantage. But if their PPFs have different gradients, the opportunity costs are different, so comparative advantage exists and there are potential gains from trade. It's also worth bearing in mind that in our modern economy, we don't use barter, i.e. we don't trade bread for cars, we trade for money. Therefore, the prices of bread and cars need to be in a particular range for both parties to benefit. And this is known as the terms of trade. Some evaluation and wider issues. Comparative advantage is a dynamic concept, so it means it could change over time with technology and wage rates and productivity. The quantity and the quality of natural resources available may change over time. Again, demographics may change over time. An aging population can all affect the quantity and quality of the labour force and their productivity. Capital investment, including in infrastructure, can affect labour productivity and therefore whether a country retains a comparative advantage of a particular good. Investment in R&D, fluctuations in the exchange rate, things like tariffs, subsidies and quotas can create artificial comparative advantages. Non-price competitiveness issues like design, reliability and quality of after-sales support might also influence the decision on whether or not to trade. Institutions including banking and legal systems will also have an impact on whether comparative advantage changes over time. So in this video we've looked at the concept of comparative advantage and we've applied it to an example. We finished off by evaluating this theory. That's it. Thanks very much for listening.